Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar on the Missouri invasive plant ranked assessment with presenters Dr. Quinn Long and Matt Arndt. My name is Carol David. I'm the chair of the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force and the executive director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation and its Grow Native program. Grow Native administers the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force, also referred to today by its abbreviation of MOIP. MOIP is a group of professionals with knowledge and experience working with invasive plants. Quinn and Matt are members of MOIP, along with other members who represent the horticulture, conservation, agriculture, and weed science sectors, and other professionals. MOIP is a networking and advocacy group that reviews, discusses, and recommends educational and regulatory action related to managing known and potential non-native invasive plants to help reduce the threats that invasive plants pose to Missouri. MOIP's purpose is to make the early detection and control of invasive plants a statewide priority. I'd like to thank our Grow Native program sponsors for 2021. It is thanks to their support and the support of Grow Native professional members that we are able to offer our online programming and so many other low-cost or free resources. This week is National Invasive Species Awareness Week, an annual event to raise awareness about invasive species, the threats that they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. In the spirit of National Invasive Species Week, in today's webinar, Quinn and Matt will discuss the Missouri Invasive Plant Ranked Assessment, why the assessed plants were determined to be invasive, why some plants can be invasive in some situations but not others, and other invasive plants not on the list. This webinar is not about invasive plant treatment methods. If you would like to learn more about identifying and controlling invasive plants, you may wish to consult the Invasive Plant Identification and Management resources at the MOIP website, and we will share links with you in a follow-up email tomorrow. Following his part of the presentation, Quinn will address questions that were sent in prior to the webinar that pertain to the assessment. At any time, attendees are welcome to submit questions about today's topic in the Q&A feature, and I will relay questions to Quinn and Matt following Matt's portion of the program. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Quinn Long is director of the Missouri Botanical Gardens Shaw Nature Reserve, which is a regional leader in the fields of native plant horticulture, ecological restoration, and environmental education. Quinn received his bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Missouri-Columbia and his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Kansas. His research interests include fire ecology, invasive species, ethnobotany, rare plant conservation, and restoration of grasslands and woodlands. Prior to serving as director of Shaw Nature Reserve, he worked within the Missouri Botanical Gardens Center for Conservation and Sustainable Development to research, conserve, and restore rare plant species at the lower Midwest and Mid-South. As a restoration practitioner, he has over 20 years of experience working on his family property near Hermann, Missouri. Also a member of MOIP, Quinn led the Ranked Assessment Working Group. Matt Arndt is a consulting forester and arborist and is the owner of Matt's Healthy Woods and Wildlife. He carries certifications from both the Society of American Foresters and the International Society of Arboriculture. In addition to his full-time forestry work, Matt also has side businesses in native seed production and custom web development. He has served as president of the Missouri Consulting Foresters Association since 2013 and is the vice chair of MOIP. He also serves on the Natural Resources Subcommittee of the NRCS State Technical Committee, the Missouri Farm Bureau Forestry Advisory Committee, and the Cameron, Missouri Park Board. And now I turn the program over to Quinn.
Thank you for that introduction, Carol, and thank you to everyone out there in our virtual audience for your participation in today's webinar about the Missouri Invasive Plant Assessment. Okay, so first I'm going to give a little background about the need and then discuss the process and then the results of that assessment. So regarding the need, the state of our knowledge of invasive plants in Missouri was lacking. Prior to this assessment, there was an initial assessment done back in the late 90s, very early 2000s, that had really grown out of date. This covered 276 species, and just one example of how much in need of an update or a revision this was. Scalariana, known to many as calorie pear or Bradford pear and other cultivars thereof, was at that time thought not to really pose any threat to native plant communities. We obviously know differently now. And so to have such an outdated assessment was simply not acceptable for a state with one of the exemplary conservation departments in the nation and a world-class botanical garden. And just to drive the point home about Callery pear, it has expanded considerably in the past 20 years and is not just invading roadsides, but also intact woodlands and other natural communities. So this is just a canary in the coal mine example of how much in need of update the assessment was. And as such, this was a high priority for the Missouri Invasive Plant Task Force. In fact, it was among our very top priorities to develop a list of invasive plants and their assessment scores to help inform other practices in the state. So backing up a bit, just briefly, I'll go over some terms. What do we mean by invasive? An invasive plant being one that is aggressive, non-native, and whose presence causes or is likely to cause economic, environmental, or human health concerns. You can find all of these definitions on the MOEP website to distinguish between native plants versus non-native, non-native being those that were introduced either intentionally or accidentally into a region. And in the case of plants, most non-native plants are actually introduced intentionally. With animals, there are quite a few accidental introductions, but most plant introductions are intentional. And invasive is different than aggressive. There are many plants, native and non-native, that can be aggressive in the garden. That is different than a truly invasive species that is detrimental to our natural communities. So just to further drive home the point that exotic and invasive are not the same thing, apples, tomatoes, wheat, none of these are native plants to Missouri, yet they're critically important to our economies, to our cultural identities, and then many plants in the horticultural trade, such as hostas, and quite frankly, the vast majority of non-native ornamental plants are not invasive. Oh, okay, sorry. The presentation just started jumping forward a few slides there. But so another example here that exotic does not equal invasive. All of these species here are naturalized, meaning that they form self-sustaining populations outside of cultivation. Senecio vulgaris, common groundsel, and in sidewalks. Depth of pink is common even in prairies, and chicories on roadsides, but they have really minimal impact on natural communities, our economies, and ecological health. But there are some species that really do cause significant problems. If we look at the flora of Missouri, of the about just shy of 3,000 species, nearly a third are non-natives. So that's a significant portion, and yet only a small portion of those are truly invasive. Those species that are invasive have significant economic impacts. You might see this study, which is often cited, was from 2000, so outdated, but even at that time, 35 billion a year economic impact of invasive plants in the United States. Obviously, that figure would be significantly higher. Environmental impacts: invasive plants threaten the health of our natural areas. They replace diverse ecosystems with oftentimes nearly monocultures of single invasive species, which then have impacts on pollinators, insects, and all numerous other ecological impacts. They can also really change the entire ecosystems, changing the soil chemistry, changing water quality, changing major ecosystem processes such as fire regimes and water tables and so forth. So suffice it to say, significant impacts of invasive species, and yes, we should care about this. So then what was our starting point? If we look at what's been done elsewhere, there's a national effort undertaken by NatureServe, which was an offshoot of sorts from the Nature Conservancy. And NatureServe developed I-ranks. We looked at this as one example protocol. They, as we did, looked at ecological impact, the current distribution and abundance, and the trends of what's happening with that distribution and abundance moving forward. They then used these rankings to come up with a very numerical I rank. We opted, as you'll see, for a bit more of a visual representation using maps that we thought were more easily distributed, disseminated with the broader public. Another really good example is Ohio, which has one of the leading invasive plant councils in the nation. And they did a similar approach to the TNC I ranks. Here you see, very, very data intensive, a small number of expert reviewers. Oftentimes you have two individuals doing a review and looking at a lot of criteria and coming up with a very quantitative outcome of that assessment. For our more visual approach, we looked to coefficients of conservatism. For those of you not familiar with this, this is a quantification of the how the fidelity of native plants to high quality intact natural communities. So it's both quantitative, but there's also a qualitative aspect in that it's based on expert opinion. To make a sporting analogy, if you look at figure skating or gymnastics, you have judges who are giving scores, so it's quantitative. But these judges are experts in the matter that they're scoring. We're not just grabbing any individual, any bystander, and asking them to provide their assessment of these attributes. So the different criteria we looked at are the impact. So succinctly, how severe is the current impact of the species on natural communities in Missouri? And you can go to the MOAB website and read all of these criteria and even see the instructions provided for reviewers. I'm not just going to read all the text on these slides, but logically we have severe, moderate, low impact, and then those that are really just restricted to highly disturbed habitats. Abundance, this is, well, how abundant the species is in the region of Missouri being assessed. And it's worth noting, though, that abundance is referring to the number of naturalized populations, not the number of individuals within a specific population. And then the trend, how rapidly the species is expanding, or perhaps it's really not expanding at all. It might be relatively stable. And this is really significant because if you look at this figure, which you'll see a few times throughout today's presentation, the invasion curve, when a species is introduced and begins to naturalize and grow outside of cultivation, early on, we typically don't know about it. We might not detect it, but it's at that early stage, that early detection, that it could actually be controlled very effectively, possibly even eradicated. What typically happens is by the time there's widespread public awareness of the problem, eradication is unlikely and really intensive efforts are required for more localized management and control. So early detection is key. So now looking at the geographic scale of the assessment, of course, it pertains to the entire state of Missouri, but there are significant ecological differences across the state. So we broke this down based on the natural divisions of Missouri and their sections with one minor modification, and that is we took the Springfield Plateau of the Ozark region and combined that with the Osage Plains Natural Division, given the ecological similarities between the two predominantly tallgrass prairie regions. So then which of these about 900 exotic species to assess? As I said, not all are invasive. We wanted to assess a fair number of species, but had to determine which ones. 142 is what we narrowed it down to. That may seem like a daunting number, but when you take into account there are over 900 exotic species, that's actually a significant reduction. We looked to neighboring states and regional, Midwestern list, other species that have been assessed and are known to be invasive in our broader region. Succinctly to explain that, if a species is known to be invasive in southern Indiana or western Kentucky, areas that are ecologically very similar to where we're located, then there's every reason to believe that they're going to behave the same way in the same climatic and geographic context we have here in Missouri. So instructions and review templates were set to reviewers statewide. These are trained field biologists, experts in their field, botanists, and biologists very familiar with the flora and natural communities of our state. And again, all of these resources can be downloaded from the MOAB website. We ended up with 26 respondents. Of these 142 species sent for assessment, we only received feedback on 132, even among the skilled botanists and biologists of our states. None of us, certainly not I, are familiar with every single species on this list and its behavior in natural communities. To be clear, these assessments were based on actual observations, what firsthand knowledge, not merely that, oh, I've heard that can be invasive somewhere and therefore going to take a guess. This was based on people's firsthand experience and knowledge in the field. We then looked at the scores for outliers to trying to make sure we didn't have any errant keystrokes throwing off the ranks. And we did require that there were a minimum of 3 reviewers per species per region for each criteria. We didn't want this assessment to be based on one lone individual's opinion, no matter how expert that opinion might be. And so here you see an example of the maps for impact, abundance, and trend. This generically is not for any actual species. And I want to focus on insufficient data and no data reported. So insufficient data would mean that we did get reviews back, but we didn't have 3. We didn't have enough to actually have an average of multiple assessments. And then no data reported means that no one reported firsthand experience with that species. So you can go to the website and download all 142 maps. You can view them, you can sort them, and we've fulfilled the initial stages of this really important goal. There you see, you can go download the PDF, or you can go to the website, you can sort. You can sort by scientific name, you can sort by common name, and we're pretty pleased with the outcome of this. Real visual representation. Here you see some examples. You can also search by query, so like type in honeysuckle, or even type in the first 3 letters of a scientific name, and it'll filter the results. So to interpret the data, I already mentioned the issues of insufficient data or no data reported, and that may just be for a specific species and its impact in a given region. And we could have we certainly had regional differences. So for instance, the boot heel being further from our major population centers, there are fewer expert botanists and biologists who have the firsthand field experience necessary to make a judgment of the behavior of some of these species. And we certainly had fewer reviews in some regions. The Ozarks, we had more than in the boot heel, as you might expect. You can actually download all the raw data as well. It is locked so that it can't just be altered and changed, but you can download and assess, look at what the reviewers were able to assess. So then what's next? Nothing's static in nature. 20 years ago, there were experts who felt that calorie pair might not be such an issue. We also obviously know otherwise now. So it will be very important for us to keep up with emerging knowledge, which is a clear goal. And there are ways to share observations from the field, both via MOIP, but importantly through the early detection and distribution mapping system, which recently has gone from just having maps that illustrate observations in the field to also incorporating modeling, which is really a key next step for weed risk assessment and the assessment of the invasive species that will become a problem in our state. As noted with the invasion curve slide, it really is important to capture these species early on when early detection and control can successfully mitigate risk and potentially eradicate those species from becoming established in our state. So here we see Nandina domestica, heavenly bamboo. At this time, only one observation in the EDD maps system, but if you look at the models of, oh darn, that slide isn't working, that transition. Well, here, I'll just outline it. If you were to look at the models, there it is predicted to become widespread throughout the entire lower Midwest and Mid-South. And based on what I've seen firsthand in the Mid-South, that's certainly a reasonable modeling outcome. And just to be clear, we use models when assessing climate change and in our forecasts. So these are very, very educated models that are being used and now integrated into the early detection and distribution mapping systems. All right, so modeling assessment. Oh, all right, my apologies. Here we go. Here's the slide I thought was 2 back. So there you go. You can see the number of models, and this is 13 different models all predict that dark green that Nandina domestica heavenly bamboo will spread in those areas with the dark green county. And they've begun to do that for all of the species. There are also USDA APHIS has a national modeling system as well. All right, so my apologies. My screen is having some issues here. And there we are. There's my screen back. All right. So next steps, did want to discuss some of the questions we had. Specifically, I had one from Lance Daw from Tomasevich Nursery. Yeah, that's right. Asking about different cultivars and whether some cultivars of a species might be less invasive than others, and whether there's actually research done with cultivars. And that's an excellent question. The answer being, yeah, there is research done with cultivars. Just to use an example, I previously mentioned calorie pear. This was for many years marketed as being sterile. But the reality is that it never was sterile. It was simply self-incompatible, meaning that it needed a genetically different individual with which it could create fertile offspring. And given that the rootstock of the different cultivars, Bradford, Chanticleer, Aristocrat, are genetically different than the above ground parts, it actually only takes one plant. Or if you and your neighbor have two separate cultivars, those can breed with one another, and invasion's off to the races. So sometimes there are misrepresentations or simply misunderstandings of the difference between sterility and self-incompatibility that can impact invasive potential. We also look at fecundity, which simply means how many fruit a different species, different cultivar might make. And there have been some, this is using burning bush as an example, there are some cultivars that were promoted as being non-invasive alternatives based on lower seed set. And here I have just a few screenshots from several studies looking at these cultivars and determining that yes, in fact, they still are highly invasive, and in some cases actually do have relative much higher seed set than initially reported. The same would be true for Japanese barberry. There's a variety cultivar, Crimson Pygmy, that had been marketed as being less of a concern, but in fact, analysis has determined that it still is very much an invasive threat. The same has been found for certain cultivars of common buckthorn like fine line. There's actually a lot of research, most of it coming out of the horticultural science trade. The journal Hort Science is really an excellent resource for many of these assessments of different cultivars. However, to Ned's point, that's not to say that there can't be cultivars that are truly sterile and thus would not pose an invasive threat. A lot of times that might involve more complex genetic mechanisms, not merely a reduced seed set. And each instance does require careful scientific assessment, which is ongoing. Then had a question from Ned Siegel asking about how different members of the same genus might be, one's invasive, one's native. What explains all these differences in how species that seemingly you might think they behave similarly because they're in the same genus. So there are a number of criteria when we bring in members of the same genus, like Lonicera, right? We have native honeysuckle vines, and then of course we have our incredibly invasive Japanese honeysuckle vine and many invasive shrubs. So one is natural enemies. And just to back up, this is a great question and one that could be its own hour-long ecology lecture. But there are a lot of factors that impact whether or not a species will become invasive, and I'll just touch upon a few. Taking multiflora rose, for example, in its natural range in Eastern Asia, it has a significant natural predator that actually predates over 90% of the fruit it produces. So it comes here to North America, that natural predator did not come with it, and so it has this massive seed set, and yet that seed is not being predated upon. Open niches, a lot of times you have species that are not very ecologically similar in the range that is invaded, and this wouldn't really be that great of an explanation for two members of the same genus like Lonicera, but it does explain how, for instance, a puncha, prickly pear cactus, became incredibly invasive in Australia, where, believe it or not, there are no native cacti. A lot of succulents, but no native cacti, and that was a major invasion there. Another example would be allelopathy, and this is where plants exude some sort of chemical that inhibits the growth of other plants around it, and this can vary among members of the same genus. There are a lot of criteria that can play into whether or not a species become invasive. And here are several of those different traits. And it's traits such as this that go into assessment of the modeling of whether a species will become invasive. And I will just say that the best indicator of whether a species will become invasive is if it has become invasive elsewhere in the world. So for instance, if we were in the Mediterranean region of California and wanted to know whether a species from the Mediterranean of Europe might become invasive, well, if it had already become invasive in Mediterranean regions of Chile and South America, that would be a very good indicator that it would also become invasive in our region as well. All right, well, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Matt, and I have this slide here. Just today, we had a top 25 invasive plants that was distributed broadly. And Matt, I'll let you take it from here, and I'll advance slides as needed.
Thank you, Quinn. And I might expand just a little bit on what you were just saying regarding the how to potentially predict the invasiveness of one species. Another study that I had seen a little while back referenced the weediness of a species in its native habitat. And there was already a question in the Q&A window regarding eastern red cedar in Missouri, and if that's considered an invasive species. And specific to eastern red cedar, no, it's not invasive, because one of the criteria for invasive is that it's non-native. But that's the type of weedy habit that you would expect to become invasive in other parts of the world in similar habitats. So moving on, as Quinn said, we just released the top 25 expanding species, invasive species in Missouri. And a little bit of background on this project. This is completely based on the data in the assessment. We had a working group that went through, and essentially we asked ourselves the philosophical question: what makes one species worse than another in terms of invasiveness, using the parameters of the impact, abundance, and trend of those species. And we went through that thought exercise and came up with a weighting system to score the different criteria against each other. And the list you see in front of you right now is the results of that. Go ahead, Quinn. And just to speak a little bit, this next set of slides were borrowed from Nate Minix, who works for the Conservation Department. And there is some good specific information for each species on these slides. So if you have interest in the individual species that are covered here, please make sure that you follow up with the recording and glean at all the information that you can. The take home that I'd like to go through on this is, again, expanding just a little bit on the need for that frontline data, if you will, and the ability to catch those new species, ideally before they ever become a problem, but at the very least early on in that infestation. And like the map right there is from EdMaps, the Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. It's you can see that there's just a few scattered instances in Missouri, and comparing that to the Missouri, the MOEP version, our assessment, you can see in a few parts of the state, only for impact is there reliable data, the 3 reviews for more than one region, and for trend and abundance, there's even less confidence in, or at least number of people willing to provide a report for those regions. And that's a common trend on a lot of these species, is the lack of data. Burning bush is a little bit of an anomaly in this list, in that the EdMaps distribution shows it being very, very widespread and scattered. Whereas right there, you can see there's only really a handful of counties that show up, even close to Missouri, in the close half of the surrounding states. But the MOEP assessment of burning bush, and this matches with my own experience in the field in a lot of the parts of the state, is that it really is widespread in terms of presence and impact and abundance, all of the different criteria. This is an instance where EdMaps is almost lagging behind in terms of being potentially used as a predictive tool. I'd really be interested to see the models that Quinn referenced in regards to burning bush and what it predicts. But just as we move through these different species, the take home is really that species that are not yet significantly in Missouri, knowing the distribution of those species in compatible habitats in relatively close proximity will certainly go a long way to helping to inform the ones that we need to be significantly concerned about in the future. And that also gets a little bit to a difference between terminology. The top 25 list is specific to expanding species, whereas the types that I'm talking about here are more so, they'd be called the emerging species, the ones that are we're trying to catch just at those first initial infestations and be able to catch those emerging species before they really become established. Whereas the ones on the top 25 list are for the most part pretty well established already, and those are the species that are really expanding. Again, you can see just the consistency between the MOEP assessment and the EDMAPs on some of these. There's by and large, a lot of these species are moving in from the south. Some are associated with river systems, the Ohio River system coming down. The Kogan grass, this is one that I don't really have a lot of experience with personally, but a highlight on that particular species, it's considered the 7th worst weed in the world. So that's one that we certainly want to be very well aware of, and do not want to allow that species to expand up the river systems and expand up into the Boot Heel and Ozarks and beyond. And again, as you can see, there's just not a lot of data in Missouri. So this is the invasion curve, or at least a version of the invasion curve that Quinn pointed to earlier. Go ahead to the next slide, Quinn. No, I didn't realize when I included that there was an animation. This is my version of the invasion curve. As of the point of introduction, prevention is no longer possible. The original version of this slide has that prevention or eradication is simple by the time it's detected. I disagree with the fact the description of being simple. Its prevention is no longer possible as of that first population that's introduced, whether it be by an escape or an intentional introduction, whatever the case may be. The prevention option is no more. I would characterize eradication being reasonable. In an awful lot of circumstances, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily reasonable to think that we can eradicate a species even by the time that it's first detected, because an awful lot of those first detections are of already established populations, and true eradication efforts may not be reasonable. I would say that they're still feasible to think that it could be done, but not necessarily reasonable. And I also would disagree. I would shift the eradication feasible line down just a little bit to where it's likely not really feasible by the time that the public is there's widespread awareness of that invasion problem. So this is the Matt Arndt version of the invasion curve. It's a little bit more pessimistic, but in my opinion, it's a little bit more realistic also.
I'd agree with that.
Well, thanks. And with that, I'd pass the mic over to Carol, and we can move through any questions that may be out there.
Thank you both very much. There's a question here about a specific plant on the assessment from Janet. How is poison hemlock assessed? She's mentioning that it's got to be high up on the list as much as she's fought it. I don't recall off the top of my head how it ranks.
My initial thought is there may be a misidentification there. It says she's in Pattonsburg. That's just right up the road from me. I'm in Cameron. To my knowledge, there is no poison hemlock in this part of the state. I could be wrong. It's happened before. But my first thought would be that it may be a misidentification there at play.
We have a question about control, and if you don't mind addressing this question, and then we might have some other questions coming in about the assessment. This is about, does prescribed fire control burning bush?
Sure, I'll take that one. It will control burning bush much in the way that it will control bush honeysuckle, which is to say that it will top kill young establishing plants. Once it's readily established, it is going to be inhibiting our ability to successfully use fire as a management tool once it's really densely established. But when we have natural communities that are in good condition and are managed with a high frequency fire return interval, that does help us to inhibit the establishment of burning bush as well as bush honeysuckle, and to keep those young plants that do establish in a small stature to where they're not reaching a large mature reproductive size class.
Thank you. Donna asks, so do we just give up on getting rid of, say, Japanese honeysuckle, basically write off huge ecosystems? And I'm sure you would say, no, we don't. We continue to control those species that are already very prevalent upon the landscape. And the work of MOAP is very much about addressing those firmly established invasive species, but we also are about looking at early detection of other species that are emerging or that are expanding. Matt or Quinn, would you like to elaborate?
Well,
Sure. Go ahead, Matt.
Speaking to the question of species that are already significantly present and very, very well established. No, I would disagree that there's a lot of benefit to just giving up on those. And taking bush honeysuckle as an example, it's extremely prevalent in many areas. It's also absent from much of the state. And what I see in my work, especially around rural communities, is there are still hotspots becoming established and overtaking more and more areas of the state. And bush honeysuckle in particular is a species that does have the capacity to eliminate oak forests as we know them. If it completely shades out the understory, eliminates oak regeneration, there will be no seedlings to replace that canopy once it's gone. So no, I would certainly advocate for continuing to try to eliminate as much of those species from the landscape as possible.
And I'd chime in, building upon what Matt just said, that even in portions of our state where a species may be very well established, such as, let's keep with bush honeysuckle, but now here in East Central Missouri, where I'm currently located at Shaw Nature Reserve, bush honeysuckle is well established. We're not going to keep it out of the region, it's already here. However, we can still manage natural communities as we do at the Nature Reserve, and intensive initial efforts to control already infested areas of our woodlands. But once we put in that initial intensive investment, if, as we do, we keep a frequent fire return interval and are vigilant about early detection and control of populations that are developing in well-managed natural communities, then it's well worth that effort, and we can conserve our native biodiversity.
Thank you. We have several questions about the ongoing sale of invasive plants, and I might address that.
Can I jump back in for just a minute, Carol? I just shared the poison hemlock assessment map. And this is a perfect illustration of why we don't take one person's opinion on what constitutes the invasiveness of a plant. So the misidentification may be on my part. So to answer the question, this is how poison hemlock fared in the assessment. Go ahead, Carol.
Thank you, Matt. So there are a number of questions about our plant growers, garden centers, nursery owners, are they aware of the ranked assessment? Are they aware of the invasive nature of some of these species? And the ranked assessment was introduced. It was at the Missouri Invasive Plant, the Missouri Natural Resources Conference in, I believe, 2018 or 2018, yes. 2018. We have talked about it at the Grow Native Professional Member Conference, which many plant growers attend that. It was announced in our Missouri Prairie Foundation Grow Native e-newsletter, which a lot of those businesses receive. And this past year, MOIP finalized a methodology for seeking feedback on our idea called Cease the Sale. Our Cease the Sale idea is an idea to cease the sale of some invasive plants. And we want this to be a very collaborative effort. And we have developed, especially through Matt's effort, a system whereby we are inviting more than 90 stakeholder groups to review species and give us feedback as to their level of support or opposition to including these species on a eventual cease the sale list. And their feedback will help us determine if we can go forward with this idea. We have already received feedback, which we really appreciate, from 2 agricultural groups and a horticulture group. And we will be seeking input. We're just poised to send out the invitation to about 90 other groups. So this idea is in place in a number of other states, in Maryland, for example, Indiana, and Ohio. Now, there is another tool in Missouri and many other states that bans the sale of certain plants, and that's in Missouri. It's called the Missouri Noxious Weed Law. And there are 12 species on that list. And that law states that those plants cannot be sold. And there are also stipulations for control of those species in the landscape. The MOIP Cease the Sale idea is a bit different. It's focusing only on sale of plants. So to answer those questions, we are presenting our idea to many different stakeholder groups, including horticulture ones. And we are very grateful for the feedback that they have given us, and we hope we will receive more feedback. And Matt and Quinn, they've been involved in this effort as well, especially Matt. You might like to, if you'd like to add anything to that, Matt.
Yeah, I might also point out that the assessment, as Quinn said early in the presentation, the maps, even the raw data, is freely available at moinvasives.org. Just click on the assessment tab, and all of the information is there. So it's not like we're keeping this proprietary. It's all of the individual reviews in addition to the summary maps. All of that is freely available. I would certainly encourage growers, sellers, nurserymen, landscapers, all of the above to take a look through that and become as educated as possible on the invasiveness of these plants included on the assessment.
Thank you. There's someone had a question about if we would be going over the questions about the assessment that had been turned in earlier. And Quinn, we did have 2 that pertain to the assessment, and Quinn addressed those at the end of his presentation. There's a question here about aggressive native plants. Is there a ranking of aggressive native plants? And I will just like to add that, yes, there are native plants that can be aggressive. In many situations, they are aggressive due to changes on the landscape. And in some cases, they can be aggressive in one area, but not another. I'm not aware of a ranking per se, because there are so many variables, but I will turn it over to Quinn and Matt, who may want to elaborate.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So a few points. As Carol said, a lot of native species that are aggressive, it's due to changes in our environment. And circling back to the eastern red cedar question. So we know historically that eastern red cedar was restricted to areas where it was protected by fire. Eastern red cedar is very intolerant of fire. Seedlings, even relatively young and well-established plants can be killed by a hot prescribed fire. So historically, it was restricted to bluffs and rock outcrops. However, in our contemporary landscape, where we have extensive fragmentation and where fire is essentially only happening on managed areas, conservation areas, nature reserves, forest service, and some private landowners, of course, are doing great work with prescribed fire, but it's not landscape scale fire throughout the state. So then eastern red cedars are allowed to proliferate in the absence of this natural disturbance. So we've just completely altered the controls, checks and balances on it in the broader landscape. In a sense, I've never thought of it this way, but coefficients of conservatism, which is a metric of the fidelity of plants to high quality intact natural communities, it's not exactly assessing the aggressiveness of invasives, but there would certainly be a strong degree of correlation between an aggressive, I believe I said invasive, I meant aggressive natives. There would be a strong degree of correlation between an aggressive native and its coefficient of conservatism, meaning that species that do not have a fidelity to high quality intact habitats, they're found in disturbed, degraded roadsides and have a coefficient of conservatism value of 1 would more disproportionately be associated with aggressive behavior. But that is not the intention of floristic quality assessment.
And that would, to put that in more of my terms instead of the botanical terms, that would be the coefficient of conservatism would essentially be a low value. There would be the weediness of the species, those weedy species, the eastern red cedar, the honey locust, the shingle oak, that sort of species are the ones that colonize old fields and become, I've always referred to them as nuisance species as opposed to invasive. A nuisance native species is essentially the native equivalent of an invasive exotic.
Thank you. In regard to, there's been a couple of questions here about, well, where do you start? You know, if you're a land manager, a landowner, and you have a number of invasive plant problems, you know, where do you start? Where do you prioritize? And when we look at a statewide level, and we look at native species, native ecosystems, really species that are restricted to specific habitats. In terms of conserving biodiversity, we really want to focus our efforts there on those species that we will lose if they are gone from a specific community. And so that is one layer of decision making that large landowners like state agencies, conservation agencies can do, is to really focus on those areas, look on at a landscape or an ecosystem level, but also looking at the specific habitats on a landscape or within an ecosystem. In terms of a private landowner or, you know, a manager of a park, well, one thing is we hope that our ranked assessment will help prioritize. And we hope that things like our expanding list, and we will be developing other lists, will help folks who have to put together budgets for control of invasive plants know where to focus their efforts on the most. So yes, it is very daunting, but that is another aspect of our work, is to provide information to help land managers and landowners prioritize and use their resources the most wisely. But Quinn or Matt, you might like to elaborate on that point.
Yeah, I'd like to take just a little bit of a tangent, I guess. And one of the side benefits that I really see of just promoting awareness in general for somebody that goes through, whether it just be the top 25 list or the entire list of 142, there may be species on there that they hadn't previously recognized as being invasive, that once they do think about it and all of a sudden they start to notice it out on the landscape. I know that's something that happens with me frequently. Once I pick up on a certain species, you realize just how prevalent it is, where before, I guess, ignorance is bliss before that point. So yeah, that to me is a hopeful side benefit of it, if not a direct benefit. of the assessment effort and the promotion around that. But going back to the question of how to prioritize everything, there's two potential approaches. You can either look at the micro approach and focus on those very specific, very niche habitats in the biodiversity that will permanently be lost if there is degradation in those habitats, or there's the bigger question of, or well, bigger in terms of landscape size and dimensionality of those species that are affecting systems at a statewide level. There's the calorie pair that's coming into a lot of CRP acres and a lot of pasture acres and a lot of woodland acres, and it's not focused on any one niche type of specific habitat, but it's a very broad scale problem. And like I talked about earlier, bush honeysuckle has the capacity to eliminate oak regeneration completely. If we lose our oaks from our forest, we also stand to lose, if not lose, then significantly decrease our whitetail abundance and our squirrels and our rabbits and our timber products industry. Missouri white oak is some of the most coveted in the world for wine and whiskey barrels. So if we lose our white oak regeneration, down the road, we also lose those major sections of our economy.
And I'll chime in. I think the question may have been targeted to this perspective of prioritization of control for an individual landowner, and that's one hat that I wear. And so I would focus on those species that are so abundant and aggressive that they are prohibiting you from using prescribed fire, if that's a tool that you're able to use. Certainly, as long as we're able to maintain a frequent fire regime for most invasive species, we're able to keep them in check. But once they're so well established that they inhibit fire, then we have to tackle that before we can effectively use that tool. And also focusing on distinct spatial units. So rather than, let's say you've got a larger farm, and if you were just to focus and say, okay, bush honeysuckle is the worst species, but I'm going to ignore the burning bush and the Japanese honeysuckle and all the others, then by the time you finished each individual woodland and treating bush honeysuckle while turning your back on the others, now you've just got a woodland in which burning bush became more dominant. So having a thorough approach on each management unit before moving on to the next is really valuable. And I will say that although it's daunting, land stewardship is incredibly rewarding.
Thank you. And we do have many questions about identification and control. And I'm afraid we're not going to be able to give to all of those as those aren't the main focus of this webinar, but we will send you some links tomorrow to all the registrants to identification and some management resources. For example, we have a really handy table that lists some common invasive plants and best management treatments and time of year and so forth. But I will say generally there are a couple of good points that I see in the chat in terms of prioritizing. And in addition to what Quinn and Matt both said, of course, if you have, for example, winter creeper climbing a tree, that's when it's going to produce seeds rather than when it's on the ground. So, or if you have a mature seed producing invasive tree or other plant, removing those seed source would be, I think Quinn and Matt would agree, a high priority. Would
Absolutely.
You say? Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's a question about, are there groups around the state that volunteer to remove invasives from public lands? Yes, there are. In terms of state parks, I would check with the friends groups of individual state parks near where you live, and those friends groups may have opportunities. I know there's an opportunity in central Missouri at Rockbridge State Park, for example. On some other public lands, I don't know as much. I can tell you with the Missouri Prairie Foundation, our land is privately owned, but we do always welcome volunteers to fill out a volunteer form on our website and help with things like prescribed burning, which is another means of controlling invasive plants. And I know, for example, at Shaw Nature Reserve, where Quinn is the director, they use volunteers and have quite a rigorous training program. So yes, there definitely are opportunities. When we know of them through MOIP, we promote those on our website. There are in St. Louis, there's the Honeysuckle Hackathon. I think stream teams, there are many, many stream teams around the state. They have invasive plant removal days as well, and Missouri Master Naturalists as well. In regard to a question about, how do we reduce the sale of some of these invasive plants? Another approach that I would encourage registrants is when you shop for plants, just politely and respectfully state your preference for wanting to purchase non-invasive plants. Again, consumer demand influences supply. So that is another approach. Or when you see plant sellers selling native plants, thank them. Tell them how much you appreciate that. When you see, for example, the Missouri Department of Transportation doing invasive plant control efforts, thank them. They have a comment option on their website. Or if you see other invasive plant control efforts going on, let it be known how much you appreciate those efforts. Conversely, if you see invasive plant problems, you might respectfully state your concern. So again, there's a lot that citizens can do through advocacy and voicing their concerns or approval. That can really be helpful as well. Let's see. It is almost 5 o'clock, and I think we will need to end now. There are, as I said, I see a number of questions here about control. We won't have time to get to all of those, but we will send some links tomorrow to help address those questions. Quinn and Matt, any last words?
Yeah, there was one more question I think it would be worth touching on real quick regarding what are the plans to update the assessment.
Oh, good.
With the current, the previous version, I guess, it was all done by Excel, and Quinn had the tedious task of manually compiling all of that, which I calculated it all for a previous talk a year or so ago, and it was something like 1.8 million cells of data that they put together and tabulated all of that. I could look it up, but it was an obscenely high number. So moving forward, the hopeful solution is to transition it to a web-based system that will allow for continual updates. So it's not a once every 5 years or every 10 years we go back and revisit it, but it can be a continually revisited thing. So it's not so much of an update as it is just a constant addition to the data set.
Thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for their participation and their interest in this really important subject matter. And I think although Matt and I have struck a pragmatic tone and not always optimistic with regard to our ability to completely eradicate certain species from the state, that does not mean that it is not worth continuing to control invasive species. It absolutely is. Even those that are well established throughout the state, there is tremendous value and benefit for our native biodiversity in controlling those species. And it's also critically important to ensure that we're proactive against the next wave of invasive species to come.
And the real world example of, even though I may be a little pessimistic about the realism of eradication, I've also enrolled in a master's project with the goal of kicking off a statewide honeysuckle eradication effort. So I'm doing it myself, knowing full well what the difficulties are that lie ahead.
And our staff here at the Nature Reserve are successfully combating invasive species here, and I thoroughly enjoy doing the same in my free time on my family property. So actions speak loudly that this effort is worthwhile.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, Quinn and Matt, thank you very much for your time and expertise sharing that with us this afternoon. And many thanks to everyone who tuned in today. We have more webinars and master classes coming up through April and more planned for beyond. So please do check back to the Grow Native website, Missouri Prairie Foundation website, and register for upcoming webinars that interest you. Visit moinvasives.org for a lot more information about the work of MOIP, and you can peruse all of the maps of the ranked assessment there as well. So with that, good night, everyone, and thank you very much.